Imagine waking up tomorrow and Russia is no longer under Moscow's control.
Kremlin falls silent. The military is divided. And suddenly, nobody knows who controls the world's largest nuclear arsenal. If Russia really collapsed, the biggest question wouldn't be why. It would be what happens next.
Beyond the headlines, this is real truth.
Picture this. You wake up tomorrow, grab your phone to check your feed, and see that the largest country on Earth has, well, effectively ceased to exist. I know, it sounds exactly like the plot of some crazy Hollywood political thriller. But right now, behind closed doors, geopolitical experts and elite institutions are actively wargaming this terrifying, real-world scenario. So, welcome to this explainer, where we're diving headfirst into a high-stakes question that absolutely demands our attention. What actually happens if the Russian Federation suddenly collapses?
So what happens the day the Kremlin loses control? Imagine the inciting incident, a sudden catastrophic power vacuum in Moscow, triggered by severe, compounding military and economic strain. The centralized grip that has held the entire nation together just shatters in an instant. Consider what those first 24 hours actually look like. We aren't just talking about a simple change in leadership here. We are talking about the very real potential for a complete, violent systemic breakdown rolling across 11 time zones all at once.
Now you might be thinking, this is just some dark speculation, right? But it's not. Elite institutions, like the Hudson Institute, are actively warning policymakers to prep for an entirely new global reality. They're analyzing how military defeat and prolonged economic isolation could literally redraw the map of Eurasia. In fact, their research states bluntly that current pressures will likely mark the dissolution of the Russian Federation exactly as we know it today. They're telling the world, straight up, to get ready. To understand why a total, chaotic collapse is actually a plausible scenario, we've got to look at a pretty grim new concept researchers are calling deathonomics. The ongoing conflict has basically rewired Russian society from the inside out, turning military service into one of the highest-paying professions you can get. This massive economic shift is rapidly replacing a traditional conscript army with a mercenary one. And the terrifying result of that? Tens of thousands of heavily armed, combat-hardened veterans whose loyalty is tethered strictly to a paycheck, not to a central government, and definitely not to an ideology.
Which brings us to part 1, warlords and internal chaos.
Think about it. If the Kremlin's money suddenly stops flowing, who do those massive private armies actually answer to? Experts assume a collapse wouldn't be a clean, peaceful divorce, like what Estonia experienced back in 1991. Instead, they're planning for violent, chaotic geographical fragmentation. We'd likely see a rapid proliferation of private armed groups, like the Wagner Group and the Kadyrovets, moving quickly to secure their own interests. The working assumption across major think tanks is that there is no moderate democratic successor just waiting quietly in the wings. Instead, subnational leaders and regional warlords would violently seize power to protect their own turf.
Research from institutions like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is already outlining detailed scenarios literally titled Chaos and Civil War. The reality here is that Russia relies heavily on a massive central system to redistribute wealth and resources across its territory. If that system fails, regional elites are going to be forced to fight each other just for their own survival. A sudden withdrawal of centralized power leaves a gaping vacuum behind, and as history shows us time and time again, power vacuums are almost always filled by raw force. Let's move into part 2, the North Caucasus tinderbox.
If you're wondering exactly where this internal friction is most likely to spark first, analysts point straight to the historically volatile North Caucasus. Based on detailed research from the Belfer Center, this heavily populated, economically depressed region contains basically all the necessary ingredients for a catastrophic conflict. Thanks to the structural legacy of the Soviet Union, which literally intentionally drew administrative borders to pit different ethnicities against one another, these 7 mountainous republics are locked in intense, simmering disputes over land, housing, and access to basic jobs.
Consider this number for a second. 67.6. That's the percentage of ethnic Russians in the greater North Caucasus region. But here's the catch. They are highly unevenly distributed. With severe internal migrations and localized rebellions already brewing beneath the surface, experts are really fearing a complete Lebanization of the region. Basically, a multi-sided, deeply fractured civil war. And a conflict of that magnitude wouldn't just stay neatly contained to the mountains. It would rapidly spill over international borders, inevitably dragging in neighboring states.
All right, on to part 3, securing the nuclear arsenal.
The very second a collapse happens, the entire world is going to be asking one truly terrifying question. What happens to the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons? Well, we need to bust a major Hollywood myth right now. While it's natural to fear some rogue warlord seizing a missile silo to trigger global chaos, geopolitical analysts point out the reality is actually much more constrained. Launch protocols and codes are heavily centralized, but more importantly, strict diplomatic contingencies exist. Responsible actors both inside and outside of Russia have deep back-channel networks ready to step in and secure the arsenal. They all recognize that preventing a loose nuke is an absolute, universal priority, no matter who happens to be in charge of the Kremlin.
Part 4. Energy markets and global shockwaves.
But hey, even if every single nuke is perfectly locked down, the immediate shockwaves of a Russian collapse are still going to violently rock the global economy. Despite heavy sanctions, Russia remains deeply embedded in the complex web of global energy. Research from Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy highlights that Russia currently acts as a crucial safety valve whenever there are unexpected supply shocks in the Middle East. A sudden collapse of the Russian state removes that safety valve entirely. We'd be looking at global oil and natural gas prices skyrocketing literally overnight, causing immediate, crippling economic pain at gas pumps and power grids worldwide.
This ensuing chaos forces massive global players, especially China, into a really precarious balancing act. On the one hand, Beijing desperately wants to avoid having an ungoverned, unstable nuclear neighbor, even as they scramble to fill the massive geopolitical vacuum alongside countries like Turkey. But on the other hand, a sudden Russian collapse would entirely vindicate China's massive current push to electrify everything. By rapidly accelerating their domestic renewable energy and green tech, China is actively building a shield right now to insulate itself from exactly this kind of catastrophic imported fossil fuel shock. The overarching takeaway from the Hudson Institute's research here is crystal clear. The West cannot afford to just stand by and watch. A fragmented Russia is going to act like a giant magnet, drawing in global powers who are eager to claim pieces of a shattered empire. The United States and its allies have to actively plan right now. That means coordinating swift responses, securing vulnerable borders, and figuring out exactly how to manage the massive, dangerous fallout of a totally redrawn Eurasian landmass.
Which leads us to Part 5. A fragmented Eurasian future.
Let's take a step back and look at the long game. What actually emerges from the ashes of the Russian Federation, say, a decade or more later? Well, the harsh reality mapped out by researchers is that whoever survives the chaos to lead the remaining rump state of Russia probably isn't going to be a moderate democratic reformer. The Hudson Institute bluntly warns that the next leader will likely be just as nationalistic and just as authoritarian. And that means the underlying existential threat to Eastern Europe doesn't just magically disappear with a regime collapse. We're ultimately looking at a deeply, permanently weakened nation. The long-term legacy of this collapse includes the permanent loss of the super-lucrative European energy market, plus a devastating demographic collapse that'll take generations to recover from. On top of that, experts warn of the cynicization of Russia, basically a future where a fractured Moscow becomes nothing more than a highly dependent junior partner in China's global expansion. The military, that'll take decades to rebuild, leaving a highly unstable, wildly unpredictable map in its wake. So as we wrap up this explainer, and you consider all these immense geopolitical realities we've dug into today, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. If the day finally comes when Moscow truly loses control and the map of Eurasia shatters into a dozen pieces, are we actually prepared for the world that will take its place?